Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here. Let's get started. We're here to talk about stress and how stress impacts not just our children, but all of us, and what we can do about it. So, the way we're going to start today is checking in for just a very brief mindful moment. So, in this moment, ask yourself, how am I doing right now? We've been hearing and learning a lot already from our keynote speakers to the breakout sessions. So let's take a breath and kind of shake off some of the stress maybe that we've been feeling sitting down for so long and hearing all these different topics that are sometimes really difficult to hear. So just take a moment to get settled, feel the ground beneath your feet, kind of just noticing what's around you, what do you hear and what do you see, if there's any smells, any tastes from the breakfast that are lingering in your mouth. Just kind of use your senses to kind of ground yourself in this moment. And the reason why we do that is so we can actually lower our stress response so that we are ready to learn. So we're already doing this experiential exercise and this experiential learning about how stress impacts us. So, well, look at this. What is stress? I've started coloring to manage my stress and anxiety. Can we relate to this? Yeah, right? So sometimes people say, well, stress is bad. Well, and it's generally speaking, that's the case, right? Stress is bad for us. But is all stress bad? Not necessarily, because, right before I had to start speaking to you here today, I felt a little stressed, right? That mindful moment we did was as much for me as it was for you. And so a little bit of stress helps us perform better. So when kids are nervous about doing a test and they feel stressed about it, that's not necessarily a bad thing. When stress becomes bad is when it goes kind of like over that peak and we are overloaded and we're burned out. So not all stress levels are bad, but when we get too much of it or when it's prolonged, when it lasts for a long time without breaks or without buffers, that's when we get into trouble. So another way to look at this is kind of like this traffic light of stress, right? Positive stress means that sometimes we have brief increases in our heart rate and we have some elevation in stress hormones in our body, adrenaline, for example. Sometimes that adrenaline rush can feel really good. That's why we go on roller coasters. You maybe, not me. We can also be in the yellow zone, which is tolerable stress. We have some serious stressors, but we also have buffers and resources that help us with that. One of the biggest resources we can have is connecting with other people. So for children, it's really important to have a caring adult in their lives. That is a huge stress buffer. Now, if those stressors become very prolonged, so they last for a long time, and there are no buffers in place, then we look at what we call toxic stress. And toxic stress is when our nervous system can't cope with the stress anymore. Can you think of some examples in each category? Kind of just think for yourself what falls in the green, the yellow, or the red. I'm going to help you out here because I came up with a lot of examples. In the green, taking a test, I gave that example, giving a presentation, or doing any kind of athletic accomplishment or playing matches, right? Soccer or any other team sport. We can feel really stressed in that moment, but it helps us perform better. Now notice that all the other stressors that I put there on this slide are in orange. And I did that for a reason, because it's not up to me to decide which one of those stressors are either tolerable or toxic. That depends on the person who experiences that stress. No one can tell if something is stressful or traumatic other than the person who's experiencing it. And it is the result of a very complex interplay of personal characteristics. Our own personality and temperament, and the environment in which we live, our abilities, and also marginalized populations, for example, people of color, people in the LGBTQ community, they may experience things as much more toxic maybe than others do. So it's a mixture of all these different kinds of characteristic that decides if something is super stressful or traumatic or not. I'm going to gloss over this real quick because our other presenters already have done a really great job of kind of highlighting how the amounts of stress we have all experienced in the last couple of years have really been highlighted and kind of made worse by the pandemic. One thing that I really want to highlight here too is that pandemic was really a pandemic of losses. We lost so many things, right? We lost actual lives, we lost health, but we also lost a lot of community events that we were all part of, and all of a sudden we're no longer there. We also experienced what we call collective trauma. Collective trauma means it's a trauma or a big stressor that has affected a large group of people. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but I think we can all agree that we have experienced collective trauma as a whole. On top of that, there were additional stressors. Some of our keynote speakers alluded to that too. There were high-profile instances of police violence, for example, followed by nationwide protests in response. Politics in this country has become highly polarized, and so all of those things have really contributed to additional stressors and feelings of being out of control. It really affected us as parents too, because a lot of parents have been telling me, I feel like when I was raising my kids, when we were going through that horrible time, when all we had was remote learning, I had to be their parent, their teacher, their therapist, their doctor, their nurse, their friend, right? Because we lost a lot of things. We had maybe childcare issues, we may have had financial struggles. So all of those things really contributed to our levels of stress too. Which all results in this cartoon that I absolutely love from The Awkward Jedi. You see here how heart is carrying the past trauma that we may have carried already. We add to that the bad news, the pandemic, and all the stressors. Now there's this minor inconvenience and heart just stumbles over and kind of loses it. And the brain is saying, I think you're overreacting. And maybe rationally speaking, we are overreacting. But when we carry so much already, one more thing can kind of push us over the edge. So the way to kind of think about that too is what we carry in our backpacks. If we have experienced past stressors or past trauma where we have felt out of control, or where things didn't go our way, or we had to move, or we lost a friend, or we broke up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or we got divorced, or we lost someone we loved, we already carry all of that in our backpacks, and then we either go to work or we send our kids off to school, right? So we as parents carry stuff in our backpacks. Kids carry emotional baggage in their backpacks, and so do teachers, by the way. We all do, right? So it might be a good idea sometimes to kind of stop and think, okay, what am I carrying and what's my child carrying? And what could be some of those past difficulties and stressors that can make that backpack extra heavy? Or conversely, what kind of resources can I provide to lighten the load a little bit for myself and for my child? So maybe think about that. You know, do I have guilt, past expectations, mistakes? Do I carry that around in my backpack? What about my student? Is my student carrying that around and into the classroom every day? So I said this already earlier. When we look at, okay, what are some of the positive resources, right? How can we lighten that backpack a little bit? Some of the positive resources we're going to go over, but the most important one is for every child to have at least one caring and trusted adult in their lives. For most kids, that's all of you in this room. And I really want to applaud you all for being here, because that means that you're here because you want to be that one caring and trusted adult, to figure out how to do this for yourself and for your children. So we're going to talk about other ways to kind of buffer and kind of combat stress responses and overall wellness. But before we do that, we have to learn a little bit about how stress actually affects our mind and our body. And I promise you it's not going to be too too boring, unless, you know, yeah, you're giggling at this picture. It's great, isn't it? Lavender reduces stress. So here's me covered in lavender. I hope you can see the pictures okay. It feels a little faded, but so what happens when stress levels are too high? I love the saying, the issue is in the tissue, because it basically means that when we feel stressed, we notice that in our bodies. And we kind of talk about our body and our mind as if it's two different things, but it's really not. The mind influences the body influences the mind. That's why things like mindfulness are so important. But when we look at how stress impacts our body, we have all these physical reactions to stress, right? So that is one way in which you can figure out, am I stressed? Is my child stressed? And it can really help, for example, to ask, okay, where do you feel your stress? So this was supposed to be 4 different sizes. It kind of shrunk it a little bit on the Google slides, but that's okay, because it could be good to just have this generic cookie cutter human being and ask yourself and ask your child, well, where does stress live in your body, right? The issue is in the tissue. So where do you feel that? Stomach ache, headache, tension in neck and shoulders? I don't know about you, but the last 4 years, I haven't been able to relax my neck and shoulders in a while. So while stress lives in the body, it absolutely also affects our mind. So when you feel stressed, think about this for a moment. When you are stressed out, is it hard to think or problem solve? Is it more difficult to remember things that typically are easier to remember? Have you ever snapped at your children, you know, without meaning to, or your spouse or your friends? Maybe you had felt really anxious, maybe even a little bit more depressed, and your mind is just going, and it's really hard to concentrate. So yes, it's in the body, but it's definitely also affecting our mind, right, in our cognitive abilities here. That's because stress also affects our brains. And I think it's safe to say for the last couple of years, we've all been stewing in stress soup, right? So fortunately, there's a lot of things we can do. We can learn about the brain and we can understand why stressed brains can learn, so we can figure out what to do to make our brains and bodies feel less stressed. I love this example. Only 3 kinds of snakes scare me. Big snakes, little snakes, and sticks that look like snakes. Yeah. It's actually true, too. I hate snakes. I'm scared to death of snakes. I can deal with the picture, but not the real thing. The reason why I like this is because it really explains stress responses. Because when I'm walking in the forest and I see a snake on the floor, I jump out of my skin. But then upon further examination, I notice that it's actually not a snake, it's a stick. And what that example shows us is that there are 2 ways to assess stressful situations. One is very quick, but not always very accurate. It's that immediate fight or flight response. Oh my gosh, there's a snake. I need to run the other way or hide or try to fight it. That wouldn't be me. Or, you know, and then when we look a little bit more closely, we understand that it's not a snake, it's actually a stick. It takes longer, but it's more accurate. So we have both stress responses available in our system, right? The kind of like the quick and dirty, and the one that takes longer and is more accurate. What both have in common is that it's a stress response. So that initial response that gets activated in response to a perceived threat, right, the snake, puts our bodies and our minds in gear to fight that danger off. Besides fight or flight, which is I'm going to fight that snake or that bear, or I'm going to run for the hills, that's one side of the equation of stress responses. There's also another side, and not a lot of people are familiar with that. Besides fight or flight, we also have the freeze and submit response. It's kind of like the deer in the headlights, where we kind of go like this. And we're kind of frozen on the spot, right? Kind of glued to the spot. They're both stress responses, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And they're very adaptive and life-saving, because if I walk in the woods and a bear comes at me, I need to have a very quick reaction and keep myself safe, right? So these are very primitive stress responses. So all those stress hormones that are coursing through my body when I encounter that bear, the adrenaline, the cortisol, the stress hormones, they get me ready to fight or flee or do whatever with that bear, right? But imagine that you're living in a home as a child, for example, that isn't safe, or you live in an environment, in a neighborhood that isn't safe. Then, as Nadine Burke-Harris says, who is an expert in adverse childhood experiences, then the bear comes home every day. So that means that that stress response gets activated all the time, every day. And in developing bodies, like our children, where everything is still developing, hormonal system, immune system, cardiovascular system, all of that then is affected by all those stress hormones. So while our stress response is adapting and life-saving, remember that earlier slide with the toxic stress in the red? If it's prolonged and there are no buffers in place, it can become very damaging, hence the term toxic. So another way to look at this, if you're a real science nerd like me, you would love this slide. This is all about the biological response, about how fight or flight activates the sympathetic nervous system, whereas the freeze and submit activates the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll wait until you're done with your picture, and then I'll go to the next one. For the sake of our presentation here, what is important to remember is that fight or flight is all about finding safety in some sort of action, whereas freeze and submit is finding safety from whatever danger we may encounter by disconnecting. What does that look like in the real world, where we typically don't encounter bears or even snakes? So fight and flight can look like you or your children have a lot of anxiety, panic, anger, very big emotions, lashing out, or overeating, having difficulty focusing, a lot of tearfulness and crying, rapid talking, a lot of rapid breathing, even hyperventilating. So that's what fight or flight can look like. The disconnect or the free-submit response in real life, not encountering bears, can look like feeling really sudden or even depressed, kind of hopeless, apathetic, sometimes even suicidal, kind of staying in the room, withdrawing from people, not having any interest in things that typically interested you or your kids, not being very hungry, not wanting to eat, very flat affect. There's like no emotion. Spacing out, always being tired. And instead of that rapid breathing and that rapid talking, it's very slowed. When I sit down with people who are depressed, I really have to watch how I am talking in that space too, because it's all slowed down. So that's kind of like that freeze, submit response. This has to do with a concept that is called the window of tolerance. Has anyone here heard of window of tolerance? My daughter is raising her hands. That's our typical dinner conversation. No, it's not. The window of tolerance is two imaginary lines. And in between those two imaginary lines, we kind of fluctuate with our mood and our stress levels. It's the amount of stress we can tolerate at any given time. And we usually kind of just stay within our limits, right? We have a bottom limit and we have an upper limit. Here, it's kind of like indicated by a rainbow. So as long as we stay under the rainbow or in between these two lines, where we kind of fluctuate, but we can handle it, we can cope with the stress, That's where we can learn, we can interact, we can engage with others. Now, if we are shooting over it at the top, that can look like a complete kind of like meltdown. Big emotions, a lot of anger, panic, anxiety, hostility even. If we are outside of our window on the other side, right? Remember the disconnect, that can look like just extreme fatigue, lethargy, giving up, hopelessness. So keep in mind that concept of that window of tolerance, because if we can stay within our window, or if we can make that window or that rainbow bigger, then there's a lot more things we can do. We can problem solve, we can learn, we can connect with other people, we can be kind. But when it's very small, that window for learning and listening and connecting with each other becomes very small indeed. This has also to do with the way our brain has developed over time and is kind of made up. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but generally speaking, our brain consists of 3 components. We have our lizard brain. It's all about behavior. That's, for example, where the fight, flight, freeze, submit response is. We have our furry little mammal on top of that. That's our emotional brain. It's all about connecting with other people, relationships, and memories. And then we have our reasoning self. That's our thinking and rational brain. And that thinking and rational brain is when we learn, it's where we memorize, it's where we strategize, it's where we plan, and it's where we process language. So we receive language, we listen, and we talk too. Now, when we are in our lizard brain, there is no room for problem solving. We are outside of our window. Another great way to learn about this, and I have taught this to kids as young as 5, and they get it. If you want to do it with me, you can, but you absolutely don't have to. So the hand model of the brain is explaining the difference between the lizard and the furry little mammal and the rational brain. That is all in our mind. So when you hold up a hand like this, you kind of fold your thumb in. So imagine then that the wrist is kind of like the spinal cord going into the palm of your hand. The palm of your hand is what we just saw on the slide, is the little lizard brain. It's the most primitive part of the brain. Remember, this is all behavior. When we fold our thumb over, this is our furry little mammal. Or our emotional brain. This is where all our feelings are and memories, relationships. And when we fold over our fingers, now we have our rational or logical brain, and where we process language, that's all there too. So what happens when we are outside of our window of tolerance, when stress becomes so much that we can no longer cope with it? We then, what is called, flip our lid. Now, even without this explanation, when I talk to you about flipping your lid, I think that is something we can all relate to. No one in this room, including me, has never experienced road rage, right? When someone cuts you off and you flip your lid. Flipping our lid is something that we all do. It's learning how to recognize that and what it means that can be really important. So when we flip our lid, guess what we're left with? This is all emotion and behavior. And that's what we see, right? When we flip our lids, or when our kids flip their lids, all we are left with is emotion and behavior. Thinking is completely offline. Is that right? Yeah. That also means that that language center, which is right here on the left, right over your ear, is also offline. So talking to your kids and saying, well, let's talk about what you did and talk about the consequences, they can't hear it. It's literally offline. So what do we need to do in order to have that conversation with them that's so important? We need to bring that lid back on, because when we are here, and I say we because the same is true for us, we won't be able to talk through it. We need to first regulate our bodies and our emotions, and then we can talk about, okay, let's figure out what happened here and what we can do differently and what the consequences might be. So when I flip my lid, or when I'm outside of that window of tolerance, I am in what we call survival brain. Survival brain cannot process or problem solve. But when I'm within my window of tolerance, or I bring my lid back down when I have not flipped my lid, then I'm in my window of tolerance and I'm in learning brain. So when your child is here in school, there's no way they're going to learn anything. Makes sense, right? So far? Okay. See that it's cool to learn about the brain, and then it makes sense. And Ryan was saying, when they're little, you go, ah. And when they're teenagers, you go, ah. So hopefully when you learn about this, you go like, ah. It makes sense, right? Okay. So when we are in survival mode, when our lid is flipped, we cannot pay attention, we can't stay focused, we cannot think before we act or speak. And how often do we tell that to our kids, right? We can't problem solve. We also cannot be patient and kind. We cannot remember things. And remember, we cannot process language or learn. So it's really important that we recognize when someone has flipped their lids, including ourselves. Because if we flip our lids as parents, we're not the best in problem solving with our children and connecting with their children and being patient and kind either. So we need to make sure that we are here too. So how do we do that? By calming our brains and body, improving our stress health. In other words, instead of disconnecting or finding safety by either acting out or by disconnecting, we want to feel safe by connecting with ourselves and with others. So there are a lot of different ways, fortunately, in which we can do that or help our students do that. This might be the most important slide in the entire deck that I've prepared for you today. The 3 R's: regulate, relate, reason. Has anyone heard of the 3 R's? Yeah, oh, cool. I'm so glad I can tell you a little bit more about this, because a typical response as a parent when something happens, for me personally, first I freak out, and then I immediately go into like, oh shoot, we have to problem solve this. So I go immediately to what we call reasoning. You know, let's figure this out. You're nodding your head. You're giving away all my secrets. But remember that when we are here, right, this is all behavior and emotion, and thinking is out the window. We cannot problem solve in that moment. So what we need to do first is regulate. We need to be regulated as adults, and we also must help our child feel more regulated. That is step 1. Step 2 is relate. Relate means, can you relate to their emotional state, the furry little mammal, or the emotional brain, right? That can look something like, I can see that this was very hard for you, or wow, I can tell that you're getting very frustrated with this, or it seems like you're very angry with me right now. So relating is kind of like validating the emotional experience that other people are having. And only if we have done regulating and relating, that's when we can go to that final step, reasoning and trying to figure things out. So what do we often do as parents? We go straight to reason, right? And we kind of miss those first 2 steps. And that can then lead to a lot of power struggles and a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding, more frustration, so that lid just stays flipped the whole time. So there's an important concept called co-regulation. And what that means is that as we as adults are dysregulated, right? If we don't have our lid on, we can't expect our kids to be calm, right? So one of the things I like to say with this slide is, no one in the history of calming down has ever calmed down by being told to calm down, right? And it's the truth. We all chuckle because we know it's true. And that's in essence the concept of co-regulating. So check in with yourself too. And here's more details about that slide, sir, about what it means to relate to people, validating feelings. So when kids say that they're worried about something, very often we say like, oh, don't worry, it's gonna be okay. But oddly, that can actually feel very invalidating because this is what they feel. So instead, you can say, okay, yeah, I get that this is hard and I understand that you're nervous about this. That's what relating is. Doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. All you do is reflect back what they tell you they're feeling or what you see is going on for them. When they say that they're scared, we often go to a variation of, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of. How about instead we say it's normal to feel scared? So for example, in the pandemic, yeah, we were all scared, right? So it's okay to let your child know, like, it's very understandable that you feel scared, instead of, oh, don't worry about it. It feels very dismissive and invalidating. Unhelpful, if they're going through a rough time, it will be over soon. We mean well, our intentions are very well. We want to let them know that it's going to be okay, because we as older adults have that perspective of time. Our kids do not. So instead we can say, well, sometimes it can take a while to get through a difficult time. So what can we do to help you feel better today or get through this together? And this last one was really kind of about the COVID-19 pandemic. I promise we won't get ill. That's a promise that was really hard to make. So instead we can say what we can do. This is about control, right? Because it was sort of out of our control for a long time there. But what we can do is take control or take good care of ourselves so we can stay healthy and do what we need to do. So here are 8 more things that kids would like to hear from you. It's okay to be different, embracing those differences. It's okay to feel mad, sad, upset, anxious, whatever it may be. You are allowed to have those feelings. I can see that you're a good or caring brother, sister, cousin, friend, right? Pick up on the good stuff. I love being your parent. There's no one else in the world like you. You're an important part of this family. You matter. Your voice matters. I want to hear from you. I'm proud of you. Those are things, don't we all love to hear that, in all honesty, right? So take note of that too, that words can go a long way with that too. I love this. Some years back, this person on, it looks like maybe Instagram, my wife and I got into the habit of asking each other, do you want comfort or solutions when the other was having a bad day or a bad time? That sentence can save us from an argument. And then the other author there added, this is key, my family says, are we listening or problem solving? So it's kind of gauging where someone is at, right? After Christmas, my oldest went back to college and had a bad case of homesickness, right? And so he sent me a text, because no one calls at that age. That's, you know, for people my age. So he sends me a text and he was like, I'm so homesick, I don't want to be here. And my response to him was like, do you just want space to process your feelings with me? Do you want me to cheer you up? Or would you like some advice on how to deal with this, right? Which is very similar to what they're saying here. And he debated and was like, so you see the 3 dots? And he said, okay, I think I need some advice. And I gave him some ideas. But if he had said, I really just need to sit with this and I need you to listen to what I'm feeling, then I would have done that. So even just asking that and being aware of that can allow you to give the response that they need in that moment. Okay. Here's Animal, if you remember the Muppet Show. I think that's really from my age. And I loved watching the Muppet Show, but Animal here is showing us what we can do when we feel stressed out or when we have flipped our lids. Fortunately, we have a lot of strategies available. It starts, for example, with breathing exercises. Some people get really tired of hearing that, the breathing exercises, but when you consider the lizard brain, breathing, sensory experiences, mindfulness, grounding, that all goes straight to that lizard brain. And when that lizard brain calms down, we can put our lid back on. There are a lot of different ways to learn how to do breathing. If you have younger children, the Alpha Breaths book is amazing. they have one type of breathing for every letter of the alphabet. In general, if you want to calm that brain down by breathing, focus on your exhale. So I always suggest to my clients, inhale through the nose and then very focused breathe out through your mouth. When you focus on that exhalation, that's when that brain starts to calm down, because it sends a signal to the brain that we are safe in this moment. Mindfulness, remember how we started today? Hey, just notice where you're sitting, what's going on in your body, what do you take in with your 5 senses, what do you see, hear, taste, sense, smell. It helps you be in the present moment, because our minds tend to run away from us. We're thinking about that grocery list and that to-do list and what we need to do when we get out of here. That is the opposite of mindful. And some people say if you live in the past, you feel depressed. If you live in the future, you feel anxious. And if you don't want to feel that way, be in the present moment. Easier said than done. So you can do mindful check-ins. That's what we did in the beginning to get us ready to learn, right? Get into that learning brain. The mindful breathing, just notice where you feel that breath. Is it in your nose, in your chest, in your stomach? And just pay attention to that. You can do a body scan, kind of just go, when I tell the kids that I work with, kind of use a little of those investigator loops and just kind of go doot, 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 and just kind of scan your whole body from the top to the bottom. How do you feel? You know, what feels tense? What feels relaxed? Or with kids, I would use words like robot or ragdoll. Riding the wave of emotion is another way to be very mindful. We can do it ourselves. Remember that important concept of co-regulating, and we can also allow our kids to do that. So when we feel that emotion, instead of immediately shutting it down or running away from it, let's ride it out together. Here's a really interesting fact. If you can learn to ride out your feelings instead of kind of getting caught up in it, like surfing the wave, they come and go in 90 seconds. Isn't that amazing? So if we feel intense sadness or intense anxiety or even a panic attack, if we learn to ride that emotion and breathe and be mindful and use grounding strategies, it ebbs and flows in 90 seconds. We can do almost anything for a minute and a half. Although panic attacks can feel a lot longer than that. It's okay to, going back to the relating, all feelings are valid. You have a right to feel and let them come as they are, because they will pass. 90 seconds. Grounding has a lot to do with using our senses to really kind of be in the present moment, and when we feel very outside of our window of tolerance and we're in that state of high anxiety, high anger, or lethargy, depression on the other side, that grounding can be really important too. Remember in the beginning I was like, just feel the ground under your feet. That's a sensory experience that goes straight to that primitive brain, to that lizard brain. You can play little I Spy games with yourself and with your child, right? Things like, okay, name 5 things in this room right here, right now that are blue. Or find 5 things in this room that are shaped like a circle. Or name 3 things in this room that if you were to touch it, it would feel smooth to the touch. This is not an invitation to touch your neighbor, by the way. So using those sensory experiences and making a little game out of it is a way to keep that lid on or bring it back on. Okay. Another great way to do that is to use fidgets. So I brought a whole bucket here. And I have to kind of remind you that when we use fidgets are different than toys. Toys are there for amusement and to play with, and that's really important too, but that's a topic for another conversation. Fidgets are supposed to be used in a mindful way so that you can increase focus and attention and lower anxiety. The reason for that is because fidgets activate our sensory experiences. Remember how I just said that sensory experience and that grounding is so important? That's how we want to use fidgets. So, for example, take this old-fashioned slinky. Now, if I feel really nervous or angry, and I'm using this slinky in a non-mindful way, doing this is not going to lower my anxiety or my anger or whatever else might be going on, right? But if I use the slinky as a fidget the way it's supposed to be used, right, is I very mindfully move the slinky around. I can feel the weight in the palms of my hands. I can hear the sound that it's making. I see the light that's reflecting off of it. And an added bonus of the slinky is that I'm using a left-right motion. So not only am I focusing on sensory input, which is calming that brain and allows us to kind of regulate again, it also, that left-right motion is deeply calming to our brain. This is why things like jogging, dancing, drumming, singing, knitting, whatever you're into, anything that's rhythmic and has that kind of left-right motion is deeply calming to our brain. So again, fidgets are great when used mindfully. That rhythmic and repetitive activity, that really calms our brain too. So have a dance party with your family. We do that at our house, and I will spare you the videos because I could have done that in this presentation, but it's bad. Here are some things that you can do. Drumming, dancing, the slinky I just showed you, playing catch with each other, progressive muscle relaxation exercises. There's tons of those online too. Noticing the difference between relaxed and tense, right? So tensing and then relaxing. Yoga is amazing, as is martial arts. Braiding, friendship bracelets. There's all these things that has that kind of rhythmicity to it that is just so soothing to our brain. Here's a couple of books or apps. This is actually, I need to update this because there are so many more out these days. Sometimes healthy distractions can be really useful when you notice that you or your child is about to flip their lid. And then you can say things like, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Or can you count backwards from 100 by threes? Or name an item or an animal that starts with every letter of the alphabet. Because that distraction is kind of activating that rational brain, right? And that will allow it to kind of to keep the lid back on. So that's another great strategy that you can use. Oops. If you really feel like you need to take a break and you want to get away from big feelings, you can also create an imaginary calm or safe place for yourself. Although it says calm and happy place now, I replaced that word safe because some people have difficulty figuring out what exactly feels safe. And so it could be completely imaginary, like being in the clouds, for example. A lot of people like the beach or the woods. So come up with a place in your mind or your child's mind that feels very soothing, calming, relaxing. So it's kind of like imagining a place where everything goes your way. And what does that look like? And when you ask that question for yourself or your child, what does that look like? Ask all the sensory questions. So in your imaginary place, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you feel like? Right? Is there a taste? So really focus on those sensory experiences there too. And when things get really tough, take a deep breath. Go to that imaginary place. Calm it down again. When things get really bad and you just have to get through the moment, you can also do what we call the container exercise. When we go to big tournaments for Taekwondo, and there's a lot of stress going on, for example, at school, and we can't bring that stress onto the mat because then we won't perform as well. We might do an exercise like this. Like, okay, imagine this container here on the side of the road. Let's put all of our stressors. It's kind of like this magical thing. We just magically transport all of our stressors and worries and anger and frustration. We pour it all into this container, and it could be anything. A pirate chest, a cookie jar, a Tupperware container, it doesn't matter because it's your imagination. Pour it all in there, and then we close it. And now we leave this behind. And when we come back from that tournament, we pick it up on the side of the road. It will be here waiting for you. But for now, we don't have to take it with us. Remember that backpack? We take the backpack off temporarily so we can perform, for example. So container exercises can be useful to temporarily kind of contain big emotions. It's not supposed to mean that we never address it, right? That's why I say when we come back, it will be waiting for us. So we're not suppressing anything, it's just containing temporarily. Practicing gratitude can be a great way to kind of move into resources, right? Because we have stress on one hand, we have resources on the other hand. So practicing gratitude, making gratitude jars. Kids love to decorate those jars. And every day or every week, find something that you or your child, your family is grateful for and put that in the jar. Not only in that moment does that give you a mind shift away from stress and more towards gratitude. On the days where it gets really bad, we can open the jar and look through that and count our blessings. The actionforhappiness.org website is great to find family activities and calendars so you can implement something mindful, resourceful, something that combats stress. It's full of ideas, tons of calendars there that you can look through. Because ultimately what we want to do is build resilience in our kids and in ourselves. Resilience is the opposite of stress. It basically means that we can learn how to cope with it. And I hope I gave you some ideas on how to do that today and what works and why it works in certain moments and what doesn't. So I'm going to make this our last slide. I was going to go in some of those in more detail, but we have run out of time, and that's okay because this is a topic that, just covers so many different things. There are 7 ways in which we can combat the effects of stress. So when we're talking about, okay, here are, all these toxic stressors that we're living with, what can we do? We talked a whole lot about mental health and mindfulness and meditations today, right? In addition to that, supportive relationships. We talked a lot about the supportive relationship between parent and child here. Supportive relationships between peers, between teacher and child. Those are all really important too. Those are 3 of the most important aspects to stress health. In addition, getting enough sleep. One of the keynote speakers talked about that too. Keep that body moving. That exercise is really important. Eating right, because when we eat, for example, a diet that's full of fat and sugars, that just flares up inflammation in our bodies. And when our body is inflamed, our brains release more stress hormones. So it leads to more and more chronic stress responses. And getting out in nature. I love the research that is coming out about being outside, right? The statistics about how much time is spent on our phones, and we talk about kids being on their phones for 7-8 hours a day, but what about us? When I go and watch sports events from our kids, almost all parents are on their phones too. So, get out in nature. There are so many benefits to being out in nature. And if it's difficult to actually be outside, at least 20 minutes a day, listen to nature sounds or look at pictures of nature. There's something really primitive about that connects with our nervous system, that calms us down too. Remember that stress lives in the body. That is why sleep, nutrition, exercise is so important too. And using these stress health goals can help you cope with that too. I brought a couple of handouts. They are downstairs in the resource fair too, but I wanted to make it easy for you in case you were interested. The two most important ones are stress health goals. It talks about all of these areas with some check marks that you can make for yourself to see, am I ready to set some goals for myself in any of these areas? And this one is just amazing. It's called our calming strategies. It's 2 sides on 1 sheet of paper with all of the exercises I talked about today, the mindfulness, the grounding, the mindful distractions, all of the things you can do in the moment when you or your child feels very stressed. Good reminders, good strategies. Hang it on your fridge so that if you need something to use in that moment, you have something available. So feel free to come and pick that up. And otherwise, we will be downstairs too with some information too. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer publicly or privately. If you would rather come up to me, either way is fine. And if you want to skedaddle out of here and get on with your day, that's okay too. So thank you so much for coming.